Hello and welcome to the New South Wales State of Volunteering Report for 2021. My name's Paul Muller from the Institute of Project Management, and this is a report we prepared on behalf of the Centre for Volunteering New South Wales with the support of the New South Wales State Government. This is the story of $127 billion, the value of volunteering to New South Wales in 2020. The story is told in 4 sections. The first describes the characteristics of volunteering in New South Wales. The second, the profile of volunteer involving organisations. In the third sections, we take a deep dive into youth volunteering. And in the fourth, we look at the economic costs and benefits of volunteering in New South Wales. To better understand the characteristics of volunteering in the state, we conducted an online survey of nearly 1,200 New South Wales residents between February and April of 2021. In that survey, we targeted quotas and weighted for gender, age, household income and location to ensure we had a representative sample of the population. And we also took the opportunity to look at the differences in volunteering between 2020 and 2019 to look potentially at the impacts of COVID. What we found is that 4.9 million New South Wales residents over the age of 18 volunteered in some form in 2020. That is 75.9% or 3/4 of the adult population of the state. Those individuals gave a total of 1.5 billion volunteer hours at an average of 25 hours per month or just under 6 hours per week. People also volunteered in 2 distinct ways. Formally for organisations or informally just directly into the community. Only about 10% of people only volunteered formally and about 30% of people only volunteered informally, with the remaining 60% doing a mix of both activities. Interestingly, just under half of people volunteered exactly the same way they did in 2019 and 2020. What we found is that even though volunteering grew slightly, it really grew in the informal volunteering space. So why do people volunteer? We asked everyone to give their top 3 reasons. And what we found is about 2 out of 3 people like to use their skills to help others. Whereas 30% of people were looking to volunteer for social connection. About 1/4 were looking to use their skills and experience in new and interesting ways. About 20% were looking to support a cause, and a similar number were looking to volunteer to develop new skills or to gain work experience. In total, in 2020, almost half of volunteering occurred close to home within the local community, but 1/3 of volunteering actually occurred online or from within the home itself. When we asked volunteers their top 3 reasons why they couldn't volunteer more, just over half said it was because they just didn't have any more time. About 30% though said the cost of volunteering prevented them giving more time. About 30% also indicated health reasons as a barrier, and 15% of people said they just weren't sure how to give more time. And a significant number also identified transport as an issue. We also asked non-volunteers why they couldn't volunteer. About 40% said no time. A similar number to the volunteers themselves said health reasons were a barrier, but significantly, 1 in 4 said they just weren't sure how or had never been asked. Only 20% of non-volunteers were genuinely not interested in volunteering. Costs was also a significant factor, although not as significant a factor as it was for people looking to volunteer more. As we saw in the year-on-year comparisons, just over 40% of volunteers in 2020 said in 3 years' time they'd be volunteering about the same as they were now. Twice as many people said that they'd be volunteering more as opposed to less, whereas only 8% said they wouldn't be volunteering at all. Among non-volunteers, only 11% were certain that they would be volunteering in 3 years' time. 50% assumed they wouldn't be, but a very significant 1 in 3 said they just weren't sure, so were undecided or uncertain about what their volunteering future might look like. Next, we looked at volunteer-involving organisations, those organisations that facilitate formal volunteering. We took a census of volunteer-involving organisations in New South Wales and got just over 1,000 valid responses, of whom about 800 provided us financial data, which motivates the later cost-benefit analysis. We also received responses from a reasonable cross-section of the volunteer-involving organisation community. They varied by size, location, and the types of services that they provided to their communities of interest. So who volunteers with these organisations? 4 out of 5 organisations reported that they used people over 65 to volunteer for them. There were a mix of people who don't work or work less than full-time, about 77%, and a significant number of people, just over half of the organisations, reported utilising people who were in full-time work. A similar number of skilled professionals were volunteering, and about 40% of organisations said that they did engage youth aged 18 to 24. Past and current program participants were also significant contributors to volunteer programs, and spontaneous or one-off volunteers also comprised a significant segment of the volunteer workforce for these organisations. When we asked volunteer-involving organisations how they recruited volunteers, 90% relied on word of mouth as a significant channel. Nearly 60% were using social media, and around half had a website. 1 in 3 also relied on open days and events, and a similar number used traditional media. Other strategies included referral by another agency, using the Centre for Volunteering or volunteer resource centres, seek volunteering, or just general brand investment or development. In total, organisations reported using about 3 concurrent methods to recruit volunteers at any given time. When it came to recognising, engaging or retaining volunteers, most organisations reported using personal connections and relationship building as a main driving factor. Out-of-hours gatherings, celebrations and events were used by nearly half. Quite a few also had awards programs such as certificates or letters of appreciation. And a lot placed emphasis on their induction and orientation programs. Interestingly, 1 in 3 organisations reimbursed their volunteers' expenses, either partially or fully. When asked about priority areas of support, volunteer management was the one thing that really stood out as a development need for volunteer-involving organisations. They were also interested in sustainability, so access to funding, grants or sponsorship, better ways to recruit volunteers, and a similar recognition and appreciation of volunteering within their organisation. When asked about the predicted supply of future volunteers, a significant number of organisations just weren't sure or predicted less volunteers, but overall the response was optimistic. About 70% of organisations predicted they would have the same or more volunteers in 3 years' time. When defining youth, we looked at people aged 12 to 24. We started with our online population survey, which really only surveyed youth aged 18 to 24, but added to that a convenient sample of youth volunteers across the range of volunteer-involving organisations in New South Wales. In total, we received 480 valid responses, which again we post-weighted for gender, age, household income and location to ensure we had a representative sample of the community. From our general population survey, we found that nearly 90% of youth aged 18 to 24 volunteered in New South Wales in 2020. And not only did they volunteer at a much more significant rate, they gave more hours, a total of just over 40 hours per month compared to the 25 hours per month given by the average New South Wales resident. Diving deeper into our full cohort of volunteers aged 12 to 24, we found that youth are far more likely than adults to volunteer for a group, an organisation such as a sports team, creative or hobby club, or an organisation with advocacy as its purpose, such as an organisation creating or distributing media or influence in the community. They were also more likely to volunteer occasionally or spontaneously for one-off festivals or events or emergency responses, and they were particularly motivated, more so than the population aged 25 and older, to volunteer for a specific issue, a political, environmental or social cause. When it came to informal or non-organisational based volunteering, youth were far more likely than adults aged 25 and over to be interested in helping out in the community or providing teaching, coaching, or practical advice to others. This was certainly more so than they were interested in providing transport or running errands or personal care or assistance for others. When it came to formal volunteering, youth definitely was seeking variety. So whereas persons aged 12 to 24 wanted to engage with 3 different types of service, persons aged 25 and over typically only wanted to engage with 2. But on the informal side, youth was slightly less interested in diverse volunteering. In fact, nearly half of youth were motivated to give their time to develop new skills or to gain work experience, compared to only 14% of volunteers aged 25 and over. When it came to barriers to youth volunteering more, again, no time was much more a significant barrier for them, as was no transport. Health reasons, though, were far less likely to be cited as a reason for not volunteering more. That said, volunteer involving organisations said that, in the main, youth were far less likely to be volunteering for them now than they were 3 years ago. Perhaps, though, the fact that these organisations were only offering youth a standard 1, maybe 2 different roles within the organisation may explain this, given that youth, as we saw earlier, were expressing an interest in as many as 3 or more different volunteering roles. And this result certainly stands in contrast to the actual experience on the ground, which is that youth are volunteering much more than persons aged 25 and over, and at a greater volume as well. Youth were also much more optimistic about their future volunteering intentions. In fact, just over a third of youth said and expected that they would be volunteering more in 3 years' time, which is a significantly greater number than the adult population aged 25 and over. Yet youth were also much more uncertain about their future, but perhaps this is as much to do with their stage of life as it does other external factors such as COVID. So how then do you quantify, in dollars and cents, the benefits or value of volunteering? Now, the Australian and New South Wales government's preferred approach to evaluating decisions in policy is cost-benefit analysis. For those of you who are interested in understanding the methodology a little bit more, know that it's not so much a single methodology, but bringing together a range of tools to get an accurate picture of the costs and benefits of any given activity. And obviously you'd want to see that the benefits or value created by an activity are greater than the costs of investment. So let's dive into that. One of our most significant standalone findings is that volunteering is not free. In fact, the average volunteer spent nearly $2,000 in 2020 out of their own pockets in support of their volunteering. Now, only about 1 in 5 volunteers were actually reimbursed in any form for their expenses, and of those reimbursements, only about 48% of their expenses were actually reimbursed. In fact, for every hour that a volunteer gives, it costs them nearly $6.50 to give that hour. So the sum of costs to volunteers was about $8.6 billion, which is about 4 times the amount that volunteer involving organisations themselves spent on volunteering activity in the state. But that's just the cash costs. What about the cost of volunteers' time? That's what we call an opportunity cost. And when we're looking at an opportunity cost, we're saying, well, if they didn't spend an hour volunteering, what could they have spent their time on? And for a number of volunteers, that would have been paid work. So of the volunteers who were in paid employment, we found that the value of their time foregone was equal to about $27.6 billion, a significant cost that you'd assume they're getting some sort of return or value on, which we'll get to in a sec. We take a similar approach when looking at the money invested in volunteering and say, well, if that money wasn't spent on volunteering, what is the next best alternative use for it? As a proxy for the best alternative use of money, we look at the 10-year bond rate, and we found that the value foregone by the investments in volunteering was just under $100 million. So in total, it cost New South Wales just over $38 billion to enable volunteering in the state in 2020. So what did we get for our $38 billion? Well, producers of goods and services, so shops and retail outlets and manufacturers and everyone involved in producing goods and services in the economy, received a benefit from that expenditure of around $2 billion. A more interesting figure, though, is what we call the productivity premium. This is the benefit enjoyed by employers as a result of their employees volunteering. So let's suppose someone is a project manager in their day job, but volunteers at a community theatre helping produce stage shows of an evening. Now, the knowledge, skills and experience that they acquire producing community theatre shows is relevant and is transferable back to their day job as a project manager. And their employer effectively benefits from this without having made any direct investment in that knowledge, skills and experience development. So to what extent do employers benefit from the volunteering activity of their employees? We asked, and we found that there's a $50 billion benefit or surplus returned to employers as a result of their employees volunteering. And that doesn't include people who are volunteering without employment, who are acquiring as capital that knowledge, skills and experience, which are returned to society in a whole heap of different ways. Sitting alongside these are a range of civic benefits that are returned as a result of people's volunteering. About $9.3 billion in wages and tax revenue is generated for individuals in the state by the expenditure on volunteering, that expenditure being just over the direct costs of just over $10 billion. But what if we had to pay volunteers to do the work they did? If volunteers weren't available and we had to hire someone through traditional channels, how much would it cost us to replace all of those volunteers? Well, the answer is around $65 billion. So that's a freebie that the state and the community effectively gets as a result of volunteering. Now, the sum of these benefits is actually the value created by volunteering. And that's our $127 billion. So in other words, for every dollar invested in volunteering, the community enjoys $3.30 in return, which is a great result however you look at it. And that is the state of volunteering in New South Wales in 2020. Now, if you'd like to learn more, I encourage you to go online and see the full report. It's published by the Centre for Volunteering. And they and the Institute of Project Management and myself are more than happy to answer any questions you might have.